Hey everyone, and welcome back to the MERN Stack Crash Course. In this episode, we're going to create our React project using Vite, and after that, we're going to start with the backend by setting up and configuring MongoDB. The first thing you'll need to do before we get started is ensure you've installed Node.js. To install it, head to Node.js.org and install the latest version. Node is the only program we'll need to directly install onto our computer because all the other technologies we can install as packages. When you install Node, it'll automatically install npm, which stands for Node Package Manager. npm is what allows us to install all the external libraries that we're going to need. We'll use it to create our React application with Vite, and we'll also use it to download the Express and MongoDB drivers. Once you install Node.js, it should automatically add itself to your path, which allows you to call Node from the command line. If you're on Windows and you want to double check this, go into your Windows search bar and type Edit Environment Variables. This little menu will pop up and open up this window. And then you want to double click on this path variable here, and somewhere in here you should see a reference to Node.js. If the installation went correctly, it should be right here, but if not, you can click this new button and then the browse, and you can find wherever you install Node.js on your computer to add it to your environment variables. Next, open up whichever IDE you prefer to use. I always use Visual Studio Code. Then open up the terminal, which in VS Code you can go to View and then Terminal here, and then you want to navigate to whichever folder you want your project to be in. To navigate between folders, you can use the cd command. Inside this file path, I have a folder called source, so I'll cd source like this. And then inside the source folder, I have one called repos, so I'll cd repos. And this is where I usually store all of my code bases. And just so you can see this better, I'm actually going to maximize this so I can bring it up a little bit. Next, I'm going to make a new folder in the repos directory by using the make directory command. All we need to do is type mkdir, which stands for make directory, and then pass in the name for the folder that we want, which I will just call, let's say, full stack project for right now. And this is where we're going to store all of our code. So that creates a new folder, and then I want to cd into that folder, so we're then looking in that folder. So I'll say cd full stack project, and now our terminal is looking in the new folder that we just created. Once you're in the folder that you want, type the following command: npm create vite at latest. What this line does is creates a new React project using Vite, and will run you through the installation process, which is super easy and just asks you a few questions. So I'll go ahead and press enter here. And first it'll say you need to install this package. We'll say yes. And then it'll ask for a name. So for this project, the Vite setup will just represent the front end aspect of our app. So for right now, I'll just name this project front end like this. And then it'll ask you what framework you want to use. Let's go down and select React, press enter. Because obviously this is a course for React. And then it's going to ask if we want to use like a TypeScript or a TypeScript variant or JavaScript. For this course, we're just going to use JavaScript to keep it simple. So we'll select JavaScript, and you'll see it says done now, and it gives us these 3 commands down here to follow. Once you've walked through all these steps, it will create a new folder with whatever name you entered. In our case, it made a folder called frontend. It gives us 3 commands to follow to get our frontend booted up. I don't actually want to launch the frontend right now, but let's cd into that folder and install all the packages that we need. And just so you can see what this folder looks like that Vite created, we can go into this open folder button here and then find the folder that you just created. So in my case, I've made it in my repos folder and I called it full stack project. So I'll go ahead and select folder here. So we can open the full stack project, and you'll see inside of this here, we have a folder called frontend that we just created with Vite. Now let's get back to installing all the packages that we need. So we'll reopen the terminal here. And then we want to make sure that we are now looking in our front-end folder and not just the full stack project. So we'll say cd frontend. And then from here, all we need to do to install all the packages that we need is run a command called npm install like this, press enter, and we'll go ahead and run it. So what npm install actually does is it looks at this package.json file that Vite created, which contains all the packages your app relies on, and then goes out and installs all of those packages. When we make an app with Vite, by default, it adds a bunch of packages for it to run, hence why we need to run npm install. Now, we could launch the front end if we wanted to right now, but let's actually focus on getting the backend folder set up before we launch the front end. Let's now go back into our terminal and let's navigate back one folder. To navigate back a folder, we can do cd .. And you'll see that now we're looking at the full stack project folder. We have a folder for our front end, but now let's make a folder for our backend. If we want to get fancy and make a folder in our terminal, we can just type make directory again, and we can say backend. Once we run that, you'll see in our file explorer here, we just added a new folder called backend. Now let's look back into our terminal, and let's go ahead and cd into the backend folder so our terminal is now looking in backend. This is arguably the most basic file structure for a full stack project, where we just have one folder for all of our front end code, and then we have one folder for all of our back end code. In a full stack project, the front end and back end code should run completely independently of each other, So we should make sure we're not muddying up the code and getting the files all mixed up. Let's start off with the backend by getting some of our backend code set up. Now, MongoDB is our database that we're going to be using, and that's one of the main reasons we need backend code for our project. So let's work on getting the MongoDB code all set up and running. In order to set up anything with MongoDB, you'll need to go on their site and first make an account if you don't already have one. Their site is just MongoDB.com, and you should be able to make an account after clicking this Try Free button up here in the top right. Once you've went ahead and made your account, head to the MongoDB Atlas page if it doesn't automatically redirect you there. If you need to access it with the URL, it is just cloud.mongodb.com. Once you're on this page, you should be on a page that says Database Deployments. Each account you make with MongoDB gets you access to one free cluster to deploy a database on, so you shouldn't have to worry about spending any money to get this set up. I've already set my free cluster up, but I'll walk you through the process. So over here, there's this plus button here, so go ahead and click that for a new database deployment, which will take you to a page that looks something like this to create a new cluster. Before you do anything else, make sure you go to the Shared tab over here on the right in order to access the free servers. If you're on serverless or dedicated, it's going to require a credit card because it'll charge you money. Once you are here, you have a few options. You can choose between AWS, Google Cloud, or Microsoft Azure. If you heavily prefer one of these services over the other, go for whichever service you like. However, if you're indifferent, I'd suggest searching through each provider and finding the location which is geographically closest to you. For instance, the cluster I already have up and running is hosted on the AWS US East 1 location. If you scroll down on this page and go to cluster details, you can go ahead and change the name of your cluster to be whatever you want. By default, I believe it's just cluster 0, and that's what mine is because I haven't changed it. Actually, mine's cluster 1 because I've already used cluster 0. But as you can see, my create cluster button here is grayed out because I already have one created, but it should be green for you. So when you're ready, go ahead and click create cluster. Once you've created your free cluster on whichever service you want, make sure you're back on this page and then look on the left-hand side and find the tab where it says Database, which should give you a screen that looks something like this. Next you want to do on this cluster menu is click this button here that says Connect. So click on it and you'll be met with a screen that looks like this, where it gives you a few options on ways to connect to your database. You'll want to click this top option here that just says Drivers. Go ahead and click on this driver dropdown and make sure you have Node.js selected because that's the driver we're going to be using for this project since we're using JavaScript. Then you can see it gives you some directions on how to get it set up. And we're going to follow those exactly. So step 1 is says to npm install MongoDB. So let's go back into VS Code and let's make sure we're still looking in our backend folder. So then what we're going to do is type it exactly as it said, which was npm install MongoDB, just like this. And then we'll give it a second to make sure it installs. What this does is installs the MongoDB package for JavaScript, which will allow us to connect to our database. Once you've done that, step 1 is complete. So let's go back to our MongoDB page. Next, there should be a little slider button here that says View Full Code Sample. Go ahead and check that box, and it should open up some code that looks something like this. Press this button here to go ahead and copy all of the code. We're going to modify this code a little bit because this doesn't factor in Express at all, but this gives us a good starting point. Next, let's navigate back into Visual Studio Code, and then let's actually go ahead and shrink this terminal for a second. Let's go into our backend folder, and then inside of our backend folder, I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call it connect.js, just like this, because this will be the JavaScript file responsible for connecting us to Mongo. Then, once you've made this file, go ahead and paste in all the things we just copied from Mongo. Before I explain what this code does, let me just shrink the terminal here, and I'm going to zoom in the code a little bit so it's easier to see. Before we get any farther, let's configure this file for our use. If you notice here, we have this URI string, which is basically just a unique key to access our application. You'll want to make sure you remove this whole password thing and enter in your actual password that you use to log into MongoDB. I would caution you, however, on putting this URI inside of this file, this connect.js file. If you're only running this on your computer and don't plan on putting it anywhere else, this is fine and won't be an issue. However, if you're using GitHub, for instance, and you're going to be making this a public or remote repository, it's probably smart that you don't put passwords in files that are going to be visible on the internet. Even if you're not making it public, this is generally a good practice to follow. Because of this, I use a package called .env that helps to hide the passwords by putting them in their own separate file that won't get pushed out publicly, which is generally good practice, as I said. To quickly do this, make sure you have your terminal open, which I should probably just keep it open. Let's reopen our terminal here. Make sure we're in our backend, and then run npm install .env, just like this. What we generally want to do now is go into our backend folder and create a new .env folder. I usually name mine config.env. I'll say config.env like this. Then I want to go in here and make a variable, which I'm going to call atlas_URI equals. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go into our connect.js file, and we're going to copy this string here. We're going to copy it, and then we're going to paste it as our URI, just like this. And note that we don't actually need these quotes here because it's not a normal string. So let's go ahead and just delete these quotes here. We can go ahead and save this file by using Control S, and then let's navigate back to the connect.js file. Now that we have the atlas URI string in this config.env file, let's go ahead and just delete the string that we have in this file. We'll delete this here. And then right below where we're requiring MongoDB, let's go ahead and tell our .env package where to look to find our atlas URI variable that we just made. To do that, type this line here. We will say require, and we'll say .env, which requires a .env library. And then we'll say .config, and then we want to pass in an object that just says path, and we'll say ./config.env. So what this line does is basically just tells the .env package that we're storing our environment variables in the path of config.env because we made the file called config.env over here. In just a little bit, I'll go way more in depth on what this require line actually does because you're going to see it quite a bit in Node. But for now, just think of it as a way of importing files or packages into Node. Now, all we need to do to access our URI is type process.env, and then whatever the name of our variable is, which we named it atlas_URI in our config.env file. I'll go ahead and save this file. And then one thing you want to make sure of in this config.env file is that you replace your actual password here. I'm not going to show you mine for security reasons, but make sure you fill your password in here or else it won't connect properly. And that includes getting rid of those less than and greater than signs on the end here. Now we've essentially taken our password and put it into our own secret file that we'll be hiding from the public if our repo isn't private. It depends on what you're using, but if you're using something like GitHub, you'll want a .gitignore file that tells Git to ignore .env files, meaning it won't make them public. This is what'll keep your passwords private. Anyways, let's get on with the MongoDB connection. At the top of our code here, after our imports, we have this const client equals new Mongo client line, and this is actually a constructor. All this constructor does is makes a new variable to represent your Mongo client by calling the Mongo client function from the MongoDB library we installed a moment ago. All that this function actually really needs is a URI string, which we've already passed in. However, in this case, we're also passing in a second argument that is an object that just provides some customization for the client. It tells the client which version to use and sets the strict and deprecation errors to true. Again, this is personal customization stuff, but we'll just stick with what Mongo gives us for right now. Before we go any farther, let's quickly navigate back to the MongoDB website. You may be wondering, where is our data actually stored on here? So let me show you. To find it, make sure you go to your database tab. We'll open up our cluster here. And then once you have your cluster open, you should see this tab at the top here called collections. And this is where all of your NoSQL data is going to be stored in the form of collections. Collections in this context of MongoDB are just a collection of essentially what are JSON objects. Over on this left-hand tab here, you can see that I already have 3 databases because of previous projects that I've worked on. For you though, you probably won't have any set up right now, so we actually want to go ahead and create some. So you can actually create a database using this Create Database button. Go ahead and click on it, and let's enter the name of whatever database you want. For right now, we'll just say, since we're building a blog, we'll just name the database, we'll say blog data. And then every database needs at least one collection in it, and it also asks for a name. So for right now, let's start off with one collection just called posts, which will represent all of the blog posts that we're making. And then we'll go ahead and click create. Once we've created it, you should see here on the left-hand side that we've just created a new database called blog data that has a single collection in it called posts. The way this works is that when we want to access or upload new posts to our database, we'll simply add objects to this post collection right here. Sometimes we might want multiple collections, like if for instance we wanted to have a collection for all of our users as well. We could call a collection users and then use that collection to store all of our user data. Just so we're entirely on the same page here, let me clarify how MongoDB was organized. At the most upper level, you have what are called clusters. Like right here, we have cluster 0 for this project, which is what we made when we selected AWS and made this big cluster that you're seeing here. Clusters are basically just the collection of all your data spread across whichever servers you decided to host on. And then inside of clusters, we can have multiple databases. This bug tracker data here, project to do at blog data, these are all databases that I made within this cluster, which broadly represents the storage locations for your project. MongoDB at heart is a database, that's what the DB stands for, and these databases are the main functionality of Mongo. And then inside each database, we can have as many collections as we want. Collections are where we store each of the NoSQL objects that we upload to Mongo, and they look a lot like JSON objects. If we had 10 blog posts, for instance, then our post collection would have 10 objects inside of it, one for each post. Before we dive back into our code, I want to quickly make a few sample objects in this post collection so I can show you how Mongo works, plus it'll make it easier for us to do testing later on. We'll take care of creating objects through our code in the coming episodes, but if you want to manually put an object in Mongo, you can hit this Insert Document button right over here, and it'll open up this window. Whenever you insert an object into Mongo, every object automatically gets an ID because each object needs a unique identifier. And from here, we can just add whatever fields we want. And this plus button will actually add more fields if we want them. So we can click this and add a couple of fields. Now, what we're wanting to have here is objects that represent a blog post. And there's a lot of different fields we can kind of include on these objects for now. But for now, let's make a few fields. We'll do, let's say title, we'll do description, and then we'll have author, and then let's say like a date created, as these are probably the most like essential fields that we could need for something that would be a blog object. And I'm actually missing one of the probably most essential fields, which would be the content. So the actual content of the post, we can add that here. And then here we can just fill in the values manually for each of these fields. And notice how on the right-hand side, you can hit this drop down here to bring up a whole array of options. There's, arrays, booleans, dates, all this stuff. We'll keep most of these as strings for right now. So let's say for this one, I'll make it something random. I'll say like Tom Cruise movie for the title. I'll say like new Mission Impossible for description. Content, I won't worry about this for now. I'll just say blah, blah, blah. Author, I'll just say it's myself. I'll say it's Austin. And then this date created will be the only thing that isn't a string. So we'll go ahead and go over here to this drop down and we'll make it a date instead. And then here we'll just enter, let's say like 2/16/2024. And it should, actually, hold on, let me go ahead and edit that real quick. It saved it as a string, but that's not what I wanted. So if I want to edit the document, you can just click this little pencil icon over here. Let's change this back to a date again. And then here, because it was already kind of in like a date format as a string, it'll automatically convert it. This is what dates are going to look like in Mongo. And then we'll just go ahead and click update to finalize the update. And here you can see we have our first official object in our post collection. I went ahead and just added 2 objects in our post collection. So now we have a total of 3 objects in this collection overall. So now that I've inserted a couple of documents, that'll definitely come in handy later. Plus, hopefully it helps show you how these object documents sort of work. One last thing with MongoDB before we get back to our code. By default, clusters and databases in Mongo will lock out any IP address it doesn't recognize for security reasons. If it doesn't recognize the IP address of your server, it's not going to let you access Mongo at all. If you want to add your IP address to Mongo so that you can access it, you'll need to head over to this Network Access tab over here on the left-hand side. I'm blurring out my IP addresses out for obvious reasons, but this is where a list of all valid IPs are kept. I don't remember if it by default adds your current IP address, but if it's not already on this list, go up here to the top right and there's this green Add IP address button, and you can go ahead and click it and it'll bring up this little window here. And there should be a button here that will say add my current IP address. This is a super important step that you can't miss, otherwise Mongo is going to block you from connecting to your own cluster within your code. Once you've done that, let's finally get back to the code. As part of the code that we copied from MongoDB, we have this entire run function here. This run function, however, is just testing and pinging the MongoDB server, which is nice for testing, but doesn't do what we want for setting up a persistent connection to Mongo. So let's actually go ahead and just for right now, I'm going to go ahead and comment out this whole function right here. Then I'm going to go ahead and go up here and I'm going to make a variable to represent the database by just writing let database. And I'll show you how this comes into play in just a moment. Next, let's think about what we actually need to do in this connect.js file. The name of the file is connect, so it would make sense that we would need to connect our code to MongoDB. However, we also need to take something else into account. We're going to be connecting this MongoDB database to a server, and we're going to have our own separate file for our server. Therefore, we're going to have to export the functions from this file so we can use them in our server file. The next episode will dive into the whole import/export scheme, but for right now, just know that we need to specify our exports in something called Module.exports. Module.exports is from Node, and I'll explain in more detail how it works in the next episode. To do this, we can just write Module.exports equals and then an object, so we'll specify curly brackets. Now, in this object, we can specify any functions or variables that we're going to want to export. The first one will be a function that will actually connect to our server. To make a function inside of an object, we can use a simple format with arrow notation. We'll name this function, we'll say connect to server, write a colon, and then we'll do parentheses for the arguments, and then we'll do an arrow function. So we'll do an arrow, and then curly brackets for the actual function content. If you look down here at our sample code, you'll notice that it has this client.connect method. However, we don't actually need to use this in the most recent version of Mongo. Instead, what we can do is just access our database directly by using the .db method. To do this, we can take our database variable that we just declared up here, and we'll set it equal, we'll say database equals client.db, just like this. And then inside this DB, we need to pass in the name of the database that we want to access. If we go back to our Mongo page and we go back to our database, we'll remember that if we look in our collections here, give me a second, that we named our database blog data. So if we're going to access the database using the .db method, we should pass in the title, which is just blog data, just like this, as a string. What this will do is assign the database variable to the blog data database we have in MongoDB. This is super helpful because this is what will allow us to actually interact with our database in our code. And just hopefully you didn't forget, this client object that we're calling the DB method on is, remember, just this object we made up here, which is created using the new Mongo client constructor. In our Module.exports object, let's add one more function that will allow us to easily grab the database whenever we need it. So let's make a function right here. Actually, we'll separate this by commas. Make a function, let's call it getDB, do a colon again, and then parentheses, and then another arrow function, just like this. And all we want to do with this function is literally just return database like this. Assuming the connection goes through with this connect to server, this database variable will contain the actual blog data database. Therefore, if we need to access it, we can now just easily call this getDB function to get it for us. Now, these two functions are going to be really important for us. Connect to server will create the initial connection between our code and our blog data database. And then anytime we want to access the database from that point onward, we can use this getDB function to give it back to us. We'll just have to be careful to only call this getDB function after this connect to server function is called, because otherwise database wouldn't be defined here. And that's going to officially wrap up this video on setting up MongoDB for your backend. In the very next episode, we're going to actually get the server up and running, and I'll explain how these Module.exports come into play. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next